So let's go through a scenario that we're all too familiar with. You've had this project that you've wanted to start for ages, but have been putting it off for one reason or another. You wanted to create a blog where you can write and publish articles. So one day, sitting on your desk, you decide, today is the promised day that I'm gonna get this thing rolling. And you get off to a speedy start. You spend 2 hours thinking about great ideas for this blog that you want to make. But when you get to the writing, it takes you much longer than anticipated to get started. You have this vision in your mind of how you want it to come out when you've written your article. It needs to be absolutely perfect because after all, it's the first article that you've ever published. You've read some other people's blogs that have heavily inspired you and you want yours to be the same. So after some consideration and having tried to get started for a few hours, you think to yourself, maybe today isn't the day that it will come out as perfect as you want it to be. And so you scrap the article and decide, maybe I'll do this another time. I think we've all had this experience where you want to start something, but you know that if you try, it won't come out as good and as great as you know it could possibly be. And this is a prime example of how perfectionism can act as a massive barrier to progress. The thought of producing something average, mediocre, or even bad can be so paralyzing that it stops us from truly excelling in our lives. And so there are a few questions then that come out of all of this. Is perfectionism really a bad thing? Surely striving to make something as perfect as possible can only be good. And number two is, if it isn't good or if it's negative, then what solutions do we have to overcome this? So let me take you back a few years ago. I was a 22-year-old medical student and I was able to get a part-time role in a corporate business. And my first task was given to me. On my first day, the marketing director gave me a quick job of organizing a protocol for some blood testing on an Excel spreadsheet. And since I was a medical student, I thought, yes, great, I've got some knowledge in this area. I'm gonna come up with some amazing work and they're gonna be completely blown away with how good this looks. So I spent a good few hours organizing the Excel spreadsheet, color coordinating it, changing the colors of the different cells, changing the font and the letter sizing. And then I took it back to my boss to get it signed off. And the reaction I got was, to say the least, anticlimactic. So he said to me, how come you've spent so much time trying to make this look good? And I said, you know what, you've given me this task, I might as well put my all into it and make it perfect. And what I got from the rest of that conversation completely changed my perspective on perfectionism even until today. He said that the aim of this task was not to come up with a finished product. It was to use the skills that I already had to come up with something that's workable, that's organized in a logical way. And he said that when the time comes, we have people whose job it is to make it look good or aesthetically pleasing. There are times to make something absolutely perfect and there are times to just make something decent, and a person should understand which of these categories a task falls in. In 1978, there was this guy called M.H. Hollander. I couldn't find a picture of him, so this would just have to do. And he was one of the first researchers to kind of define perfectionism. And he defined it as the practice of demanding of oneself or others a higher quality of performance than is required by the situation. And when you think about it, isn't this exactly what happened to me in that scenario we mentioned earlier? The situation didn't really require me to make it aesthetically pleasing and change the colors, etc. It was just to organize it. But still being me, I demanded this of myself, and this led to the task being completed too late, which meant that the project progressed a bit slower than ideal. So let's roll back to our question. Is perfectionism a good thing? And you'll find that the answer, like everything, is a bit more complex than that. And researchers and scientists and those guys have come up with really two types of perfectionism. One is a good type and one is a bad type. Let's start with the bad type. So the bad type is referred to as neurotic perfectionism or dysfunctional perfectionism. And the people that have this trait set unrealistically high standards, and they rigidly adhere to them and define their self-worth based on the achievement of that high standard. And so in simple terms, it means that they stop trying. And this is where procrastination comes in, putting things off, but also prematurely stopping the task that was once started. And this is honestly not a nice situation to be in, because it leads to this like vicious cycle. A person stops trying and they procrastinate, which means that they obviously won't achieve because they haven't tried, and because they haven't achieved, it leads to a decreased self-worth. And then because they have a reduced self-worth, that means that they are less likely to try, which means a decreased achievement, and you can see how that cycle moves. But then there is also a more healthy type of perfectionism, and this is known as normal perfectionism or adaptive perfectionism. And these people pursue higher standards without attaching their self-worth to it. Meaning that even if they don't achieve X, Y, Z, it doesn't affect the way they see themselves. But also the way they set those targets is much more intentional. They set the targets high enough to allow the person to push themselves, but not high enough that it means that it's completely impossible to achieve it, right? It's a bit more realistic, but also unrealistic enough to push the person. And this takes us on to our second question. What is the solution? And there are two things I've learned. The first one is fairly simple, straightforward, and it's to understand and realize that perfection does not exist. I know you're gonna be like, oh, I've heard this before, stop waffling, we've heard this all in school, whatever. But when you think about it, it really does, it makes sense, yeah? And to illustrate this, I'm gonna give an example. Remember back in the day when the very first iPhone, around 2007, was released?
iPhone.
And we thought, what an amazing product.
I'm buying $100,000 worth of iPhones.
This is perfect. I mean, it's got a touchscreen, it's got a camera, it's barely got any buttons. It's perfect. But now, 13, 14 years later, we've got the iPhone 12 and it completely smashes it out of the park. So does that mean that the very first iPhone that was released was crap or bad? No, it just means that it was great for its time. Had Steve Jobs had this type of dysfunctional or neurotic perfectionism and not released the iPhone in the first place because it wasn't thin enough or the battery life wasn't good enough, then we would have never had this revolution into the touchscreen mobile phone market for the following decade. And the same principle applies to our own day-to-day tasks and our own life. Like for example, making YouTube videos, right? My very first video, I couldn't have expected it to be as good as some of my more recent videos, right? Because over time I get a lot better. And now when I look back at that very first video, it's really not great. So a person cannot expect from themselves greatness when they haven't spent a great amount of time practicing in that thing. But you can expect greatness from yourself maybe 10, 20, 30 years down the line, or when you've spent 10,000 hours doing something. So humble yourself and don't expect perfection from yourself too early. And the second thing is to apply the sprinter methodology. And this is something I got from that conversation I had with that marketing director. And he said, set and allocate a specific amount of time that you want to spend on a new task. Do it as the best as you can during that time and sprint as fast as you can, but put the outcome out of your mind. And then when the time is up, it's up. You're not supposed to be fiddling around and trying to make it a bit better. It's time to take the next step in that project or in that task, or hand it in for feedback, or do something else different from what you're doing at that time. Instead of using your happiness or how good you think you've done on that task as a measure or as a yardstick for the completion of that task, instead use time as a measure of completion for that task. And that might help, and it's something that has helped me in the last few years with not being too perfectionist all the time. So I hope you liked that video, and that is the end. If you liked the video, then like the video, comment, like, subscribe, follow me on Instagram, all of that good stuff, and safe.